Hey everyone, today on Big Out Books I wanted to make a video chatting about my experiences reading Victorian literature in honor of Victober, which I'm sure, as most of you know, is a month-long readathon hosted by some great booktube channels where they're just encouraging people to pick up some Victorian literature in the month of October, which I think is the perfect time of year for this readathon. I know for myself, as the weather gets colder and colder, I become more of a recluse. I stop feeling guilty about not going outside and doing things, and I'd rather be spending my nights in, which gives me more time to tackle some of these really hefty novels. Even though the long page counts can seem kind of off-putting, I find reading Victorian literature is a nice antidote to becoming too much of a millennial with zero attention span. I found when I first started seriously reading Victorian literature, I had to almost rewire my brain because I was not used to authors who were so long-winded and took so much time getting to where they were going, using so much detail, and the whole why say in 10 words what you could say in 100 mentality. I mean, could you imagine a Victorian author having a successful Twitter page? These are people who are not used to expressing their thoughts in the simplest way possible. Sometimes this lack of brevity can be frustrating, and it will make you want to raise your fists to the sky and curse serialization. But for the most part, I find it creates a very immersive reading experience, and I do like that about Victorian literature. I mean, when you get into these stories, you are living them. You are getting descriptions of everything, every random side character that's living in the town. So if you're into what an author's doing, this is great, and these are novels that you can really jump inside and live through. Another amazing aspect about Victorian literature is that these authors are not afraid to throw down some serious plot. So even though these books can be long, there's often a very engaging storyline, lots of drama, and so many great twists and turns, some of which are truly jaw-dropping hundreds of years later, which is incredible. I'm by no means an expert in Victorian literature, and there are still so many books that I haven't gotten around to reading yet, but still I enjoy running my mouth and talking anyway. So I'm going to be making 3 videos for Victober. Today's video is about my top 5 favorite Victorian writers. Part 2 is going to be about 5 Victorian classics that I did not enjoy reading, so I'm going to drum up some controversy with that one. And part 3 is going to be a TBR, a list of 5 Victorian authors that I have not yet read but want to get around to reading soon. So let's start off today with part 1 and talk about some amazing Victorian writers. By far, my favorite author from this period is Thomas Hardy. I sometimes forget that he's even a Victorian novelist because compared to a lot of other works from this time, his books just feel so modern. And I think that's partly because he was into challenging a lot of societal values and norms, particularly in his later books, like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, where he plays with the idea that maybe having sex is natural and society having all these rules and regulations about it is unnatural. Also, his last book, Jude the Obscure, which was famously burned in public by a bishop, is all about challenging all the big institutions of society, universities, organized religion, marriage. This book is asking some serious questions. But if you're looking for a more lighthearted side of Thomas Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd is a charming pastoral romance. And we've got The Return of the Native. This is also a romance, but it's a lot more dark and brooding. And then there's my favorite Thomas Hardy novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. This is about a man who sells his wife and child at the fair one day and has to live the consequences from making this terrible decision. So those are all the Thomas Hardy books I've read so far. They've all been amazing. There are a few more that I have on my shelf that I haven't read yet, including The Woodlanders, which I've heard nothing but amazing things about, so I'm saving it for a special occasion because I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna love it. Then I've also got Two on a Tower, which I really don't know very much about, and also Wessex Tales and some of his poetry. For my next author, I'm going to cheat and list the Bronte sisters as one author, which I really shouldn't do because they each have their own style and thing going on. But the best part about the Brontes is just trying to contextualize them and just wondering, like, where did these wild women come from? Their books are so strange, so unlike anything else that was coming out at the time, so passionate, and it's just like, who are these ladies? My favorite Bronte sister has to be Emily. Sadly, she only wrote one book. Happily, that one book was a masterpiece, and that is, of course, Wuthering Heights. This book is just so joyously demented. Like, this book is just way too intense for its own good. Like, why is everyone in here so passionate, so crazy? This book is just a wild ride. It's so much fun to read, but it's so twisted. It's so strange. And I could just imagine this book coming out and people reading it and being like, what the hell is this? Like, nobody wrote books like this. So you just gotta love it. Go, Emily, go. Up next, I just finished reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and this was pretty solid. I feel like Anne is kind of a lone wolf in the way that her sisters Emily and Charlotte have these really stormy and brooding male love interests who are kind of these terrible people but are romanticized in their texts, and Anne Bronte does not do that. So she does have a garbage, terrible male love interest, but that's what this book is about. It is about him being a crappy husband. It is about the terrible abuses that his poor wife goes through at a time when women did not have a lot of agency, and she decides to leave him in this book. So that is a pretty scandalous tale, and Anne is not having any of it. She is not afraid to call out men for their bad behavior in this book, and sometimes the protagonist Helen comes across as a little too stern and preachy, but still, this is an important book, and it tackles a lot of big themes, not only about marriage, but also about addiction and whether it travels down through the generations. So, a very fascinating book. And in last place, I'm going to put Charlotte. Sorry, guys. Jane Eyre. I don't know what to say. I feel like this book kind of meets in the middle from what the other two sisters were doing. So it has a bit of that wild gothic energy that we see in Wuthering Heights, but it's also got that stern self-righteousness that we see in Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But really, this is a Bildungsroman, so, you know, some of it's boring, some of it's interesting. We should probably talk about how weird Mr. Rochester is. Like, he's just a seriously strange character. Like, there is a scene where he dresses up like a fortune teller in disguise to try to get Jane to talk about her feelings. So it's like, what? He is a very strange man. Also, his character and this whole story in general takes a huge beat down after you read Wide Sargasso Sea. So there's that. But at the same time, even though Mr. Rochester is a huge creep, I was still kind of like rooting for this romance to happen the whole time, which like I don't understand. So yeah, I have conflicting feelings about this book. I think that Villette is probably the stronger of Charlotte Bronte's novel. It's a lot more mature and reflective. It's also got a very mysterious protagonist who like withholds information and doesn't tell you exactly what's going on. It's a lot more autobiographical as well. So even though Jane Eyre is kind of the more famous of the two books, I'd say Villette is a stronger showcase of what Charlotte Bronte can do. I still have more reading to do for each Bronte sister. I'd love to read some of Emily's poetry. I have to check out Shirley by Charlotte and Agnes Grey by Anne. So please let me know if you've read any of that stuff, because I do not know which one to go to next. Up next, we have George Eliot. I first had to read George Eliot for an English class where we read Silas Marner. I thought it was a little simplistic, but also very charming, and I found myself growing fond of a lot of these characters, even though this is a pretty short book. But really, the George Eliot book that has impressed me the most is Middlemarch. I own the world's worst copy of this book. I can't wait to replace it with a nicer one. The first few chapters of Middlemarch are missing in this edition, and they are replaced with the beginning of Anna Karenina. So even though I have this hideous Frankenstein copy, I still really enjoyed this novel. It's not an epic book about heroes doing crazy things. This book is a testament to the power of just everyday individuals making a difference in their own small way. So I found that it had a really powerful message at the heart of this book, and you get so invested in the happenings of this town, and there's a lot going on here about people getting married to the wrong people and how that plays out. So this is a really incredible novel, and I wouldn't be afraid about the length because you just get sucked right into this world. It's going to be tough to top Middlemarch, but the next two George Eliot books that I'm looking forward to reading are going to be The Mill on the Floss and Daniel Deronda. The next author on this list is Charles Dickens. I've only read one book by him, but I was seriously impressed by Great Expectations, and I went into it with pretty low expectations. I thought that this is a book that I probably don't even need to read since I'm so familiar with the plot and everything that's going to happen. I mean, if you've seen that South Park parody episode, you'll know it does a pretty good job at exploring everything that happens in this book. But anyway, I was still really sucked into this story. Pip goes through quite an adventure. I fell extremely hard for his Uncle Joe. He was just like the sweetest man. He was so funny. I don't even want to get into talking about Joe too much because I get seriously emotional thinking about him. Like, he's so ignorant, but he's so sweet and he just wants the best for Pip and he's so pure. And I also love Miss Havisham. Like, she is me, this gothic spinster walled up in her own misery, like, wonderful, wonderful lady. And like everyone says with Dickens, the side characters are wonderful. Like, there is not a forgettable person in this text. Everyone is so, like, weird, and you're always wondering what's their deal, and Dickens is a lot of fun. So I am excited to read more by him. Two of his books that I have to go are The Old Curiosity Shop, which sounds pretty weird, and Bleak House, which I got for $2, so 900 pages worth of novel for $2 is a pretty good deal. The last author I'm going to talk about today is Lewis Carroll. This is a giant annotated edition of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. I haven't reread these books in quite a few years. It has been some time, but what I remember the most that really impressed me about these books were the way that Alice interacted with everyone that she met, and the way that every conversation that she had was almost a game. And that was really influential to me, that idea of, like, figuring out how to talk to people. What are they looking for? Social norms are kind of ridiculous. The world is crazy. So I'm pretty excited to go back and revisit this book in such an expanded edition. This book has a lot of illustrations and notes that will explain Lewis Carroll's references. I know a lot of this book is about, like, logic and math, which I'm sure are things that went right over my head the first time that I read it. Lewis Carroll is so imaginative and brilliant. His books can appeal to both younger and older readers. He might have been a bit of a creep in his personal life, but let's not get into that. So really, I loved these books the first time that I read them, and I am super excited to return to them. So those are my 5 favorite Victorian novelists. Please let me know in the comments who some of your favorites are, because as I was saying before, there are still so many books that I have not read from this era yet, so I would really appreciate some direction in where I should be going next. So thank you for watching today's video, and perhaps I will see you in part 2, where I continue to blather on some more about Victorian literature.